Our tale from Trench Crusade today takes us to New Antioch, the great fortress city of the Principality, in the year 1914. It is the story of Brother Konrad Metz, a signals intelligence cleric of the lowest order, who spends his days listening to static and his nights dreaming of a girl who does not know he exists. This is the story of 2 days that changed everything he thought he understood about loyalty, about the enemy, and about the particular darkness that lives not in hell, but in the hearts of men who have chosen it willingly. They gave me a room with no windows. This was not accidental. The Signals Intelligence Directorate occupied the 3rd basement level of the Admiralty Annex on the Rue des Martyrs, a building that had the outward appearance of a minor ecclesiastical records office and the inward reality of a place where light was considered a distraction and fresh air a luxury afforded only to those of sufficient rank to merit a posting above ground. I was not of sufficient rank. I was Brother Konrad Metz, 3rd Order Auxiliary Grade, certified competent in standard heretic cipher protocols by the Signals Certification Board of the Church of Rome, with a final examination score of 68 out of a possible 100, which placed me in the lower third of my intake year, and ensured, with the mathematical precision of institutional hierarchy, that I would receive the posting nobody else wanted. The room was 8 feet by 12. There was a desk, a lamp, a rack of listening equipment that occupied the east wall, a prayer board with the required icons, and a chair that had been repaired with wire in 3 places. The wire was mine. I had brought it from home in Wiesbaden when I first arrived, because the chair had already lost 1 leg by the time I inherited it. And I had learned in my first week that submitting a requisition for furniture replacement required the countersignature of a Grade 3 officer and would take a minimum of 6 weeks. I fixed the chair with wire instead. This was the kind of resourcefulness that my examination score had failed to capture. My work was listening. Before I tell you what I found on the 2nd day, I want to tell you about the 1st, because the 1st day was ordinary in the way that only becomes significant in retrospect. And I think the ordinary matters as much as the extraordinary in any account worth giving honestly. The morning routine began at 6. I rose in my room in the Sump district and performed the morning office at the icon of St. Dismas in the niche opposite my window. 3 prayers, the required scripture, the daily petition for clarity of mind and steadiness of purpose, which I had added to the standard form myself because it seemed useful. I am not an especially devout man in the demonstrative sense, but I'm a man who believes in the value of routine. And the morning office is routine of a particular quality. It orients the day. My father had said something like this about the opening of his watchmaking shop and the unlocking of the cabinet, the laying out of the tools in their specific order, the winding of the demonstration piece in the window. Not piety, but discipline. The two are related, but not identical. Breakfast was bread and coffee at a stall on the Rue de Brasseur that I had been using since my 3rd week in New Antioch, run by a woman named Greta, who recognized me by order rather than by name, which suited both of us. She handed me the same thing every morning without being asked, which is a form of consideration I find more comfortable than conversation. I ate standing, as I always did, watching the street fill with the early shift workers heading toward the factory district. The gray morning light coming down between the buildings at the angle. It came down in autumn and drank the coffee, which was good coffee. The best thing about Greta's stall, and then walked the 20 minutes to the Admiralty Annex along the route I knew, through streets that smelled of coal smoke and wet stone. The Annex was a building I had thought, when I first saw it, was entirely unremarkable. This was the point of it: 6 stories of grey stone on the Rue des Martyrs, with a facade of ecclesiastical administrative architecture, arched windows, a small saint icon above the main entrance, brass plaques listing the occupying bodies in the precise official language of church bureaucracy. Records. Office of the Admiralty Auxiliary, Registrar of Signals Certification. These were real offices. They occupied the ground floor and parts of the first. Below them, in the basements, was what the building actually was. I descended through the main entrance, past the front desk where Brother Stein was on morning duty, as he was every Tuesday and Thursday, signing in on the departure register with the time and my room number, and went down the first stairs, and then the second, into the corridor that I had walked for 18 months. The corridor was always the same temperature regardless of the season outside. This was a function of its depth and its stone walls, and I had come to associate it with a specific quality of stillness. Not the stillness of a place where nothing happens, but the stillness of a place that has been absorbing information for so long that it has developed an institutional patience about it, the kind of patience that comes from being below the weather and below the noise and below the ordinary level at which events are experienced. I had read in one of the Directorate's historical summaries that the basement levels of the Annex had been intelligence operations rooms since the founding of New Antioch's formal signals service in 1742. The stone absorbed something from that. I cannot explain this more precisely, but I noticed it every morning when I descended. My room was the third from the corridor's eastern end. I had decorated it with 3 things: a small framed photograph of the Rhine Valley near Wiesbaden, which my mother had given me when I left, and which had a water stain on the lower right corner from an incident during transport that I had never been able to fully explain, the prayer board with the required icons, and pinned to the wall above my desk, a hand-drawn map of the Mediterranean theater that I had assembled from publicly available naval intelligence bulletins and supplemented with my own signal-bearing data, color-coded in pencil, blue for confirmed heretic fleet contacts, red for probable contacts, green for possible. The map had been growing for 18 months and had reached a density that made it look, to anyone who did not know what they were looking at, like abstract art. I knew what I was looking at. The heretic raiding fleets had been active in the Mediterranean for the better part of 4 months, striking coastal positions from their base of operations somewhere southwest of Gibraltar, running night raids against supply convoys, and occasionally probing the outer harbor defenses of New Antioch itself before withdrawing. They were fast, they were disciplined, and they communicated in cipher, a layered Gotic cipher that combined standard numerical substitution with a rotating key structure that changed on a schedule we had not yet cracked. My job was to sit in my room with no windows and listen for their transmissions on the assigned frequency bands, log each contact, note its bearing and signal characteristics, and pass my logs upstairs for analysis by people who had graduated in the upper third of their intake years and had been assigned offices with windows. I did not resent this. I told myself I did not resent this. The truth was more complicated, as truths tend to be. I did not resent the work itself. The work was good work. The patient, careful work of a man who pays attention, and attention was something I was genuinely good at. What I resented, with a precision I had had 18 months to hone, was the texture of how I was regarded by the people around me. There is a difference between being considered junior, which is simply a function of rank and time, and being considered beneath consideration, which is a function of origin. I had not attended the Pontifical College of Sacred Letters in Rome. I had not been sponsored by a noble house or a church foundation with a name that opened doors. I had come from a signals certification course in Wiesbaden, the son of a watchmaker, certified competent at 68 out of 100, and in the Signals Intelligence Directorate of New Antioch. This was a distinction that traveled ahead of me in every room I entered. The directorate occupied most of the third basement, a long corridor of connected rooms that housed approximately 40 clerks and analysts of various grades, 3 senior officers, a cipher library, and a break room with a coffee urn that was never quite empty and never quite full. The senior officers had offices with actual doors. The Grade 2 analysts shared rooms in pairs, which they decorated with personal items and complained about with the comfortable intimacy of people who have reached a sufficient level of institutional standing to have opinions about their accommodation. The Grade 3 auxiliaries like me occupied the smaller rooms at the corridor's far end, near the ventilation shaft that brought in cold air from the harbor district 2 streets away, carrying with it, in damp weather, the smell of salt and bilge water, which I had stopped noticing after the first month. I had been noticing other things instead. Elisabeth von Knobelsdorff had arrived at the directorate in March of the previous year. A transfer from the Church Intelligence Corps headquarters in Lyon, where she had apparently distinguished herself in ways that were discussed in the break room with the reverence normally reserved for military victories. She was Grade 2, which placed her 2 rungs above me on the directorate's formal hierarchy, and she occupied one of the shared rooms midway along the corridor with a signals analyst named Sister Bauer, who was quiet and thorough, and the kind of person who disappears entirely from your memory the moment they leave a room. Elisabeth did not disappear from memory. She was tall, dark-haired, with the particular economical posture of someone who has learned through long practice to take up exactly as much space as their work requires, and no more. She had a habit of reading reports while she walked, which should have looked careless and in practice looked as though she had simply solved the problem of divided attention that the rest of us were still working on. She wore the standard directorate uniform with a small silver pin at the collar that I had learned, after several weeks of surreptitious study, was the symbol of the Order of St. Dismas, which was either a personal religious devotion or a family inheritance, and I had never found a natural way to ask which. The rest of the directorate staff arrived between 7 and 8, in the order their grades and duties required. I had learned their patterns the way I had learned the signal patterns from the fleet, through patient observation over time. Sister Bauer arrived at 7:15 with a leather document case and never made noise. The cipher analysts from Grade 2 came in pairs, talking in the corridor in the way of people who have been sharing work and a room long enough that they communicate in shorthand. The Grade 3 auxiliaries arrived at varying times, with varying degrees of engagement. Corporal Wintz, who had been in the room next to mine for 6 months and whom I had concluded was entirely competent and entirely invisible to the people making promotion decisions. Sister Hoffman, who was sharp and meticulous and had the misfortune of being assigned to a frequency band that produced almost no actionable contacts, and brothers Lemke and Strasser, who arrived together and sat together and seemed to regard the work as something to be endured rather than done. I did not judge Lemke and Strasser for this. The work was, objectively speaking, often very like endurance. Most shifts produced nothing significant. The heretic fleet transmitted on a schedule that was irregular by design, and the majority of what I heard on my assigned bands was static, and the majority of what was not static was atmospheric noise, and the majority of what was not atmospheric noise was legitimate church communications on adjacent frequencies bleeding into my range. The work required the kind of attention that is most difficult to sustain, not the attention of engagement, where something is happening that demands your focus, but the attention of watchfulness, where you must remain ready for something that may not arrive at all. I had, over 18 months, developed a specific quality of this kind of attention. I didn't force it. I had found that forcing it produced a kind of cognitive fatigue that degraded the very acuity it was trying to maintain. Instead, I settled into the work the way my father had described settling into a watch repair. Steady hands, steady breath, not looking for what you expected but for what was actually there. He had told me once that the watches that defeated apprentices were not the complicated ones, but the ordinary ones, with a single component slightly out of specification, because the apprentice came in expecting complexity and missed simplicity. The lesson had stayed with me in ways that extended beyond watchmaking. I had spoken to her 3 times in 18 months. The first time was in the break room, where I had reached for the coffee urn at the same moment she had, and we had performed the brief, mutually embarrassed negotiation of proximity that such moments require. I had said sorry, unnecessarily, since neither of us had done anything requiring apology. She had said it was fine, poured her coffee, and left. The second time was in the corridor, when I was carrying a stack of signal logs to the cipher library and she was coming the other way with a decoded transmission sheet. We had almost collided. She had moved left as I moved left, then right as I moved right, in the reflexive choreography of 2 people in a narrow corridor making the same mistake simultaneously. She had smiled. A brief, contained smile, the kind that acknowledges the absurdity of a moment without investing significantly in it, and stepped past me. The third time was more recent. 3 weeks ago, as it happened, and it was from this third conversation that the architecture of what followed began to be constructed. I had been in the cipher library working through the previous week's signal logs, looking for a pattern in the timing intervals of heretic fleet transmissions that I thought might indicate something about their operational schedule. This was not work I had been assigned. It was the kinda F-work I did after my assigned work was finished, in the time between the end of my official shift and the point at which remaining in the building stopped being diligence and started being the thing my mother, in her practical Wiesbaden way, called stubbornness. Elisabeth had come in to return several reference volumes that she had apparently borrowed from the library weeks earlier and had been carrying around in a canvas bag that she set down on the reading table with the particular relief of someone who has been meaning to do something for long enough that the doing of it produces genuine satisfaction. She had glanced at what I was doing. Most people in the directorate, when they glanced at what I was doing, looked away again immediately, in the manner of people who have identified an object as not requiring their attention. Elisabeth looked at it for a moment longer. "Timing intervals," she said. It was not a question. "I think there might be a watch change rhythm in the transmission schedule," I said. "The gap between the 3rd and 4th contact window each night is 6 minutes longer than the others, consistently over 3 weeks. She looked at the log sheet for another moment. She had the focused stillness of someone reading something properly, not scanning for key words. "The night crew relieves the day crew at 2200 hours, she said. "There would be a handoff period? Equipment checks? Briefing?" She was quiet for a moment. "Have you reported this?" "It's on my weekly log summary." She nodded as though this was exactly the kind of answer she had expected, which had the quality of a mild correction without any of the content of one. Then she put the reference volumes on the return shelf and picked up her bag and left. The next morning, Captain Otto Reichert had stopped by my room. Otto Reichert was Grade 1. The Directorate's senior operational analyst, which placed him at the peak of the institutional hierarchy below the 3 senior officers who had actual offices with doors. He was 32, broad-shouldered from a military intelligence family with 3 generations of service. His father had been a cipher analyst in the Levantine campaign. His grandfather had worked directly under the legendary Field Marshal Königsberg in the border wars. He wore this inheritance with the easy assurance of a man who has never needed to question whether he belongs in a room, because every room he had ever entered had been prepared for his arrival in advance. He had 2 friends who were always with him in the way that powerful people often have people near them who have confused proximity to power with the exercise of it. Holzer, a squat, competent signals analyst, who laughed at things Otto said slightly before they were finished, and Brenner, who was tall and quiet, and whose function in the group seemed to be to stand in a way that made rooms feel smaller. Otto had leaned in my doorway to my 8x12 room, and looked at me with the expression of a man examining something he has no particular reason to respect. "Metz," he said. "Timing intervals." "Yes," I said. "Von Knobelsdorff mentioned it." I was aware of a particular internal quality that I can only describe as the sensation of something tipping, like a cup at the edge of a table. I did not say anything. "She mentioned it to me," Otto continued in the tone of someone clarifying a sequence of events that they consider relevant. "Because that is how intelligence is processed in this directorate, through the established chain, by people with the appropriate clearance to evaluate its significance." He paused. "Not through the corridor." "I wasn't sharing intelligence through the corridor," I said. "I was returning library books." There was a moment. Holzer made a small sound that was not quite a laugh. Otto looked at me with an expression that had gone from examination to something that required more precision of language than I was used to applying to facial expressions. It was not anger. It was something more patient than anger. It was the expression of someone who has already arrived at a conclusion about you and is merely completing the formality of your presence. "Stay in your lane, Metz," he said. He left. Holzer left. Brenner, last, closed the door that I had not asked him to close. I sat for a long time after that. The ventilation shaft brought in the smell of salt and bilge water. My lamp hummed. On the frequency band I was assigned to monitor, there was static, and more static. And then, as there almost always was, nothing of significance. I thought about Elisabeth von Knobelsdorff looking at my log sheet with real attention, and about Otto Reichert saying her name to me in the tone of a Mai. And marking territory, and about the particular quality of the closed door. I thought about these things for the rest of that first day. That day, after the conversation in the break room, my 3rd conversation with her, I had sat at my desk and run the timing interval analysis again, more carefully than before, because the part of my mind that was not occupied with the fact that Elisabeth von Knobelsdorff had looked at my work and found it worth a comment was occupied with the work itself. The 6-minute gap was consistent across 19 separate observation windows. In statistical terms, this was not a coincidence. It was a pattern. In intelligence terms, a pattern was a prediction, and a prediction was an operational tool. I had written it up clearly and attached it to my summary. I had been thorough. I had been precise. I had noted the confidence level and the evidentiary basis and the possible alternative explanations and explained why I had discounted them. This was the kind of work I could do well when no one was looking. The examination score of 68 out of 100 reflected my performance under conditions of institutional anxiety and the specific cognitive pressure of knowing that the examiner had already formed a view of you before you entered the room. It did not reflect what I could do at my desk, alone, at 8 in the evening, with only my lamp and my signal logs, and the smell of harbor water through the ventilation shaft for company. Then Otto had arrived in my doorway. I limped home that evening. Not from Otto's words alone, though they had left the kind of bruise that sits not in the body, but in the chest, somewhere between the sternum and the left shoulder blade. But because Brenner had been waiting for me in the stairwell at the end of the shift, with Holzer behind him, and the conversation had been brief and physical, and had involved the third step from the bottom, which I caught on the way down with my right knee in a way that made standing difficult for several minutes. Brenner had said nothing. This was consistent with his general function. I walked home through the lamplit streets of New Antioch with my knee aching and my pride in a condition that my mother's vocabulary would have described as bruised, and my father's would have called a waste of good resentment. My room in the Sump district was small and smelled of other people's cooking and had a view of the wall of the building opposite, which had a saint icon pressed into a niche at the third floor that I had developed the habit of including in my morning prayers, not because I had a particular theological connection to St. Dismas, but because the icon was there, and praying toward something felt better than praying toward nothing. I lay on my bed with my knee elevated and thought about timing intervals and about the particular 6-minute gap in the Heretic Fleet's nightly transmission schedule, and about the fact that when Elisabeth von Knobelsdorff had looked at my work and called it potentially significant, she had been right, and that this rightness was currently sitting in Otto Reichert's weekly summary report with no attribution. I thought about this for a long time. And then, because I am the kind of person my father made me, which is to say the kind of person who cannot stop thinking about a problem once he has seen it properly, I thought about something else. The timing intervals I had been tracking were in the transmission logs for the Heretic Fleet's standard communication bands, but there was a secondary frequency, a high-band shortwave frequency that appeared occasionally in the background of the logs. To be dismissed as interference or atmospheric noise by anyone not specifically looking for it. I had noticed it 3 weeks ago and logged it as a possible artifact, but lying in my room in the dark, with my knee aching and my mind in the particular sharpened state that comes from controlled anger, I ran the timing of that secondary frequency against what I had been looking at, and I arrived at a number that made the inside of my chest go cold. The secondary frequency didn't have the pattern of atmospheric noise. It had a pattern of deliberate transmission, and the transmissions were not coming from the direction of the sea. I slept badly and woke early, and went back to my room with no windows and started the second day. The morning was ordinary. This is one of the things I have learned about the days that change your life. They start ordinarily. You eat your breakfast. You walk through streets that smell of coal smoke and bakeries. You descend into the basement corridor and exchange minimal acknowledgments with your colleagues and sit down at your desk and put on your headset and begin listening to frequencies that contain, in the normal course of events, nothing of significance. The secondary frequency was there again. It was faint, genuinely faint, the kind of signal that required the specific quality of attention I had been trained to bring to ambiguous contacts. But it was there, and it was structured, and when I plotted its characteristics against the bearing data available from the Directorate's 3 antenna arrays, the triangulation came back with a result that I looked at for a long time before I was willing to accept that the equipment was reading correctly. The signal was coming from the port district, not from the sea, not from outside the walls, from inside New Antioch, from somewhere along the southern waterfront, in the stretch of the harbor that accommodated the commercial wharves and the smaller private moorings that served the fishing boats and the coastal traders. I noted the time and the bearing and the signal characteristics and wrote them up in my log in the careful handwriting my father had insisted on, because a watchmaker's son learns early that precision is not a personality trait, but a professional obligation. Then I attached the log to my morning summary and walked it up to the duty officer's desk and waited while he read it. The duty officer that morning was Captain Fischer, a career intelligence man of 60 who had the manner of someone who had received a great many reports over a great many years and had developed, through long practice, a comprehensive taxonomy of which reports required action and which required filing. He read my summary. He read it again, more briefly. He put it down. Interference, he said. The bearing triangulation is consistent across 2 separate morning contacts, I said. The signal characteristics match a pattern from the fleet transmission logs. Bearing triangulation from Directorate arrays in a port city picks up a great deal of reflected signal, Fischer said. Warehouse equipment, medical instrumentation, church broadcast infrastructure. He picked up the summary and put it in his in-tray, which was where things went when they were finished. Log it as a possible artifact. If it recurs 3 more times on consistent bearings, bring it back. I was dismissed. I walked back along the corridor. Otto Reichert was at the coffee urn, and he watched me walk past with the look he had been giving me since the conversation in my doorway, which was the look of a man who has made a decision about you and is confirming it at regular intervals. "Heard you went to Fischer with a ghost signal," he said. I stopped. I should not have stopped. "It's not a ghost signal. Fischer thinks it's interference." Fischer didn't look at the bearing data. Otto turned from the coffee urn and looked at me with the patient, conclusive expression. "Metz," he said, "what you heard is background noise from the harbor district. What you want it to be is a significant intelligence contact that will make Fischer change his assessment of you and get you out of the room with no windows." He paused. "Those are different things. Learning to distinguish between them is what separates useful analysts from people who waste everyone's time." Holzer, who was at the table, found something to laugh at in this. I did not say anything else. I went back to my room and sat at my desk and listened to my assigned frequency bands, and thought about the bearing triangulation, and about Fischer's in-tray, and about the smell of the secondary signal, the particular quality of it, the transmission structure, the timing, which was not the structure of interference or atmospheric noise or warehouse equipment or medical instrumentation or church broadcast infrastructure. It was the structure of a coded military transmission. At 11 in the morning, I made a decision. I want to be precise about this. It was not an impulsive decision. I am not an impulsive person. My father's watchmaking had given me a deep constitutional preference for understanding a mechanism completely before touching it. What I did at 11 o'clock on the second morning was the product of everything I had been thinking since the night before, laid out in order, examined from multiple angles, and assessed against the alternatives, of which there were 2, continue to log the signal, and wait for the 3 recurrence threshold Fischer had set, or act on what I believed I already knew. The first alternative felt, with a clarity I could not fully argue away, like the wrong choice. Not professionally wrong. Procedurally, it was entirely correct. Institutionally, it was the appropriate response. But a fast strike craft of the heretic raiding fleet, if that was what was generating the Signe, and I believed with increasing certainty that it was, did not wait for 3 recurrence thresholds. Whatever was being unloaded at whatever dock that signal was coming from would be gone within hours, and the signal would recur only in the data record, long after the opportunity to act on it had closed. I was going to need equipment. This presented a problem of a specific and potentially career-ending nature. The Directorate's equipment locker was on the 2nd basement level, accessed by a key held by the duty officer of the day, checked out against a sign-in log that required rank, purpose, and counter-signature from a Grade 2 officer or above. I was Grade 3 Auxiliary. My countersigning options were limited to people who were unlikely to countersign. What I had, however, was the particular combination of invisibility and institutional knowledge that accrues to people who have spent 18 months being overlooked in a confined space. I knew which duty officers were meticulous about the log and which were sloppy. I knew that the 2nd locker, the one containing the portable direction-finding equipment that was used for field signal triangulation, had a padlock that had been replaced 6 weeks ago with a standard issue lock whose combination I had watched the duty officer set, and had, without any conscious intention of using this information, remembered. And I knew that Fischer had a meeting with the Senior Signals Review Board from 11 to 1, which meant he was 2 floors above me for the next 2 hours. I was not proud of what I did next. I want to be clear about that. I understood as I did it that taking equipment without authorization was an offense that could result in my immediate discharge and possible criminal referral to the Church Disciplinary Board, and that the combination of taking equipment and being wrong about what I had heard would make the outcome significantly worse than simply being wrong. I understood this, and I did it anyway, because the alternative, sitting in my room listening to assigned frequencies, while a heretic signal pulsed from somewhere inside the walls of New Antioch, and nobody acted on it, felt, in a way I could not completely rationalize but also could not dismiss, like the worst mistake. I also took a sidearm. This required a second act of unofficial procurement from a different locker that I will not detail at length, except to say that it involved a distraction I engineered in the corridor, and a period of approximately 40 seconds in which I was doing something that would, if observed, end my career definitively. Nobody observed it. This surprised me slightly, because I'm not naturally a person who does things like this, and I had expected to feel more visible. I signed out of the building on the standard departure log, break for personal appointment, back by 1400 hours, and walked out into the air of New Antioch at a pace designed to suggest a man with unremarkable business to attend to. The port district was 20 minutes from the Admiralty Annex on foot. I took the route through the Sump that I knew from my walk home, avoiding the main harbor approaches where the guard maintained checkpoints, cutting through the back streets that smelled of fish, salt, and old timber and the particular industrial water that collects where old cities meet old harbors. The portable direction-finding equipment was in a canvas bag over my shoulder, and the sidearm was in my coat, and I felt simultaneously more purposeful and more frightened than I had felt since my arrival in New Antioch. The secondary signal was still transmitting. I could hear it on the portable set, faint but present. And as I moved through the Sump streets toward the waterfront, the bearing sharpened from a general southward direction to something more precise. the southern end of the commercial wharf stretch, near the old hospitaller dock that had been condemned and closed off after a structural survey 3 years ago. The dock had a sign on its gate, "Dangerous structure, access prohibited by order of the Port Authority." And a chain across the entrance that had been there long enough to have rust on it that was real rather than decorative. The chain, I noticed as I approached, had been recently handled. The rust on the contact points of the padlock was fresh broken. I stood at the gate for a moment. The signal was coming from inside. I have thought about this moment many times since, and what I think about is the quality of the choice available to me. I could go back. I could file another report. I could stand outside the condemned dock with my portable direction-finding equipment and compile the most precise and thoroughly documented signal contact in the history of T. He signals Intelligence Directorate and bring it to Fischer when he came out of his meeting at 1 o'clock, and it would go in his in-tray, and it would have a higher evidentiary standard than anything I had previously submitted, and Fischer would either act on it, or he would not, and by the time the question was resolved, the dock would be empty. Or I could go in. I went in. The dock was a long rectangular structure, roofed in corrugated iron that had rusted through in several places, letting in narrow bars of pale harbor light. The water at the far end was black and still, no movement on the surface, and for a moment I thought I had misread the triangulation, and the dock was empty. Then my eyes adjusted to the interior light, and I saw the boat. It was moored at the far end, against the dock's back wall, in the shadows. A fast strike craft, the kind I had read about in the intelligence reviews of heretic fleet operations. Low-slung, minimal superstructure, built for speed and concealment rather than endurance. Its hull had been treated with something dark and non-reflective, and the lines of it were wrong in the particular way that heretic engineering is often wrong. Functional, precise, but carrying in its proportions the trace of a design philosophy that does not share our assumptions about what a vessel is supposed to be. Against the dock walls on both sides of the boat, stacked in rows that reached my shoulder, were crates. Large crates, constructed of dark timber with iron banding, marked with stenciled numbers that meant nothing to me individually, but had a collective character I recognized from the intelligence summaries of heretic naval supply operations. I had read 3 reports in the past 6 months that described this specific crating format. The reports described the contents as high explosive compounds of infernal manufacture. Formulations that did not require the friction-sensitive handling precautions of conventional ordnance, which made them ideal for transport, and which produced, on detonation, effects that the reports described in technical language that I had to read twice before I understood what they were saying. I understood now, standing in the condemned dock with these crates on both sides of me, what they were saying. There were 8 figures moving between the crates and the boat. Naval raiders in the dark, grey, operational kit of the heretic fleet, working in the efficient, unhurried manner of people completing a task they have done before. They were not rushing. They had the quiet confidence of people who do not expect to be interrupted. I was still processing the scale of what I was looking at. The quantity of ordnance represented by these crates. The implication of a heretic strikecraft inside the harbour walls of New Antioch, undetected, at a condemned dock that had been out of operational use for 3 years. When I shifted my weight to back away and put my foot down on a loose board. The sound was not loud. In any normal context, it would have been inaudible. In the particular silence of the condemned dock, with 8 people working in deliberate quiet, It might as well have been a pistol shot. Every head turned. I ran. The dock gate was 20 meters behind me, and I covered it in a dead sprint that I did not know I was capable of, and I was through it and into the back street before the first shout came from inside. I turned left toward the Sump streets and ran, and I was aware as I ran of something that was not quite sound and not quite sight, but was some combination of peripheral instinct. The particular quality of the air in a narrow street when someone is moving through it who is very good at not being seen. I ran harder. The Sump streets were narrow and winding, and I knew them from my nightly walk home, and I used this knowledge the way I would have used a map. Cutting corners I knew led to larger streets, and avoiding alleys I knew terminated in walls. I could hear nothing behind me. This was not reassuring. The absence of audible pursuit from someone equipped with a stealth generator, quenching infernal technologies that diffract light itself, was not the absence of pursuit. It was simply the absence of something I was capable of detecting. I came out of the Sump into the Rue du Moulin at a run that had degraded to a fast, limping walk, my knee from the previous evening reminding me of its condition, and I turned toward the Admiralty Annex at a pace I cannot describe as dignified, but which was at least directed. I was going to get back to the building. I was going to get to Fischer or to anyone with a telephone and authority. I was going to report what I had seen, and the consequential questions about how I had come to see it would be addressed. Afterward, in whatever disciplinary context seemed appropriate, because the alternative was that those crates sat in that dock until someone used them. I reached the alley beside the annex and turned into it, and that was when it happened. I want to describe New Antioch in the middle of the day, as I ran through it, because it is the kind of city that you only really see when something is wrong. Under normal conditions, the daily routine of the shift bells, and the market hours, and the guard patrols, and the trench pilgrim traffic on the main approaches, New Antioch presents itself as a city that has been at war for so long that war is simply its condition rather than a departure from normalcy. The walls are enormous and omnipresent, the 77 towers marking the skyline in every direction, and the church pennants move on the morning wind, and the factories run their shifts with the same indifference to the wider situation that factories everywhere have. And the people of the Sump go about their lives in the particular way of people who have adapted to proximity to crisis by not thinking about it. Running through it is different. Running through it, with the smell of the harbor behind me and the bearing data from the condemned dock resolving in my mind into the specific arithmetic of what I had seen, the city had a different quality. Not sinister exactly, but precarious. A vast and ancient structure, resting on foundations that were being tested in ways its surface did not show. The walls were thick, and the towers were manned, and the garrison was professional, and somewhere in the basement corridor of the Admiralty Annex on the Rue des Martyrs, 40 people were sitting at their desks processing signal data under the assumption that the intelligence apparatus that protected them was oriented in the right direction. It was not oriented in the right direction. The thought was one I had to hold carefully because it was too large to hold all at once. The condemned dock, the strike craft with its dark, non-reflective hull, the crates with their heretic stencil numbers, the harbor permit with its intelligence officer's counter-signature. These things were connected in a sequence that had a conclusion, and the conclusion was that the enemy had been in the city. Had arranged to be in this city, had arranged it with the assistance of someone who understood the exact mechanisms of the apparatus that was supposed to prevent exactly this. And the apparatus had not known. I turned into the alley beside the annex. He was simply there, not stepping out from somewhere, not emerging from a doorway. Simply there, in the alley, between me and the building entrance, in a way that suggested he had been there for some time, and had been waiting for me to arrive. He was wearing nothing that I could describe well, because the stealth generator made the edges of him uncertain. He was a presence more than a silhouette, a density in the air, the way a shadow is denser than the general dark around it. What I could see clearly, because they were not subject to the same obscuration, were his hands. The claws were Tartarus-forged, the intelligence summaries had said, quenched in the waters of the river Styx. I had read this as the kind of technical description that intelligence reports use to convey information to people who will never encounter the thing being described. I understood it differently now, looking at them in the alley beside the Admiralty Annex. Dark metal, longer than fingers should be, with an edge quality that was not sharpness exactly, but something more fundamental than sharpness. The kind of edge that has been forged in a place where the properties of materials are decided by different rules than the ones that govern steel. He had no tongue. This, too, I had read. The Death Commando's tongues are ceremonially removed at the end of their training so that they can never speak of what they have learned. He communicated in hand signals, a complex system the intelligence summaries described as inscrutable to anyone outside their order. He made no signals now. He stood in the alley and looked at me with eyes that I could see, pale, entirely expressionless, with the particular quality of patience that I have since learned to associate with predators that do not need to hurry because they have already identified the conclusion. He moved forward, one step, then stopped. This, the intelligence summaries had also described. The Death Commandos play with their targets, not from cruelty, or not from cruelty alone, but from assessment. They are evaluating, always, the threat level of what stands before them, and they are adjusting their approach accordingly. What he was assessing me as in that alley was something low enough in the threat hierarchy that he could afford to take his time with it. The Tartarus claws were at his sides. He had not raised them. He moved forward another step and stopped again, and the quality of that patience was the most frightening thing I had ever encountered, because it said, without words, his words were gone after all, that there was nothing I could do that he had not already accounted for. The pistol was in my coat. I reached for it. He watched me reach for it with no change in expression and no change in posture, and took another step forward. I raised the weapon, and it was at this point that the last thing I clearly remember is the sound of the alley cobblestones rising to meet me, and a smell of damp stone. And then nothing. I want to tell you what I know about Death Commandos, because what I knew going into that alley was what I had read in the intelligence summaries, and what I knew coming out of it, or rather, not coming out of it, waking in the condemned dock with my wrists bound, was something different, and the difference matters. The intelligence summaries describe the Death Commandos as the Heretic Legion's most elite covert operatives. Selected in childhood from among the most physically capable heretic youth, sent beyond the gates of hell for a period of training that the summaries estimated at between 5 and 8 years, depending on the individual, though they were careful to note that time within the infernal domains does not have a straightforward relationship with time outside them. What emerged from this training was something the summaries called a completed Death Commando, a formulation I had always thought was clinically inadequate for what it was describing, like calling a cathedral a large roofed space. The claws, the stealth generators that diffracted light itself, powered by the heart of an innocent. the tongues removed ceremonially so that nothing could be spoken. The summaries were precise about these things in the way that people are precise when they are describing something they have never encountered and are working from inference and the accounts of the very few who had encountered it and survived. What the summaries did not describe with precision was the quality of patience. Not the patience of waiting. That is a different thing, a controllable thing. A thing that a disciplined person can sustain through will. What I mean by the quality of patience I felt in the alley is something closer to the patience of absolute certainty. The Death Commando in the alley did not behave like a person who was confident. He behaved like a fact, like a component that has been placed correctly in a mechanism and which is now performing the function it was designed to perform. There was no contingency in how he moved, no awareness that the outcome might be otherwise. He moved toward me with the quality of a door closing. I raised the pistol, and he let me raise it, and I pulled the trigger, and heard with the specific clarity of a person in the final moments before impact the sound that a weapon makes when it has been quietly unloaded by someone who got to it before you did. I woke to brightness. Not the brightness of the Admiralty Annex, the brightness of the condemned dock, lit now with work lanterns that had been arranged at intervals along the walls, casting a warm industrial light over the crates and the strike craft, and the 8 naval raiders who were no longer working but standing at intervals in the space with the stillness of people waiting for something to finish. I was sitting against a support pillar, my wrists bound behind it, with rope that had been tied with the professional thoroughness of people who have done this before. My coat was gone. The pistol was gone. The canvas bag with the direction-finding equipment was gone. My knee ached with the compound ache of old injury and new impact. My head had a specific quality of pain centered above my left ear that told me the Death Commando had not used the claws, which meant I was alive for a reason they had decided in advance. I looked up. Otto Reichert was standing in front of me. He was not in directorate uniform. He was wearing the dark civilian coat of a man who has taken care to be unremarkable, with the collar turned up. And he was looking at me with an expression I cannot describe as anything other than satisfaction. The particular satisfaction of a man who has been waiting for a specific outcome and is now in the presence of its arrival. "Metz," he said. I looked at him. I did not say anything immediately because I was still in the process of assembling what I was seeing into something that made sense. And making sense of it required revising several assumptions I had been operating under for months, and revision of this kind requires a moment. Otto waited. He was, I had to admit, in the strange clarity of being tied to a support pillar with my hands behind me, genuinely patient. It was one of the things I had always thought about him, even when I was resenting his existence. He had a quality of patience that went beyond simply being unhurried. He could wait for things. He had been waiting for this, apparently, for quite some time. I looked at him for what felt like a long time. The work lanterns made the dock warmer than I had thought it would feel, and the crates were very still around us, and the naval raiders had resumed their work, not unloading now, but arranging, shifting things in the precise and methodical way of people completing a final stage of preparation. The strike craft sat at its mooring with the dark patience of something that has done what it came to do. The rope at my wrists was tight enough that my hands had gone partially numb, which meant I had been here for some time, long enough for the circulation to be affected, which I estimated at 20 minutes minimum. I had been unconscious in an alley and transported to a condemned dock in the harbor district of New Antioch, and nobody had seen this happen. which told me something about the hour and about the Death Commando's route, and I filed it in the part of my mind that continued to work despite everything that was happening to the rest of me. Otto was watching me put it together. He had the expression of a man who was enjoying a performance he had rehearsed many times in his imagination. "You traced the signal," he said, not as a question. "I told Fischer it was interference, and I thought that would be the end of it. You're persistent, Metz. I'll give you that. More persistent than your examination score suggested." "You're the intelligence officer," said. My voice came out steadier than I expected. "You authorized this." He spread his hands in a gesture that acknowledged the accuracy of this assessment with a kind of relaxed precision. "Someone had to. A fast strike craft carrying this quantity of ordnance doesn't dock at New Antioch on a forged harbor permit without an intelligence officer's counter-signature. The permit review protocol was quite straightforward once I understood how it worked." He looked at the crates with a proprietary quality, as though they were something he had spent money on. "It took 2 years. The planning, the cultivation of the right contacts, the careful accumulation of the right authorizations at the right moments. 2 years of patience." "To do what?" I said, though I was already understanding it. "What is all of this for?" He looked at me with the expression he had been giving me in the corridor for months, the comprehensive assessment expression, but it had changed slightly now. The contempt had shifted to something that was not quite respect, but was at least recognition. He said, "Military intelligence, the directorate, the people who run this war from their basements and their window offices and their comfortable certainties about who is worthy of consideration." He paused. "The people who look at a man like you and put him in a room with no windows, and look at a man like me, with my family, my record, my connections, and still cannot see what is standing directly in front of them." I stared at him. "You're blowing up the directorate," I said. "The Admiralty Annex," he said. "The directorate is a part of it. There are also 3 signals relay stations, the harbor command post and the primary cipher library." He said this with the calm of someone describing a plan they have reviewed many times. "The heretic fleet has promised me a position. High Captain's Staff, Signals Intelligence Analysis. Real work. Work that is evaluated on its merit, not on whose name is on your graduation certificate." I thought about the cipher library. I thought about the 40 people in the basement corridor. I thought about Sister Bauer, who disappeared from memory the moment she left a room, and about Fischer, who had 2 hours in the afternoon, when he was always at his desk reviewing logs. I thought about the portrait of St. Dismas on the collar of a woman who had looked at my timing interval analysis with genuine attention. "Elisabeth," I said. Something moved across Otto's face that I had not seen there before. It was brief and quickly managed, but it was there. "Von Knobelsdorff," he said, with the controlled flatness of someone enacting control, "is a complication I have managed. She's in the building. She's always in the building at this hour." A pause. "This is not my concern." I looked at him and said nothing because there was nothing to say that would change. Nosing the arithmetic of the situation, which was that I was tied to a support pillar, my weapon was gone, and the decision about what happened next was entirely his. The Death Commando was somewhere in the dock. I had not seen him in my initial assessment of the room, but I knew with the same instinctive certainty with which I had felt him in the alley that he was present, in the quality of the air, in the particular stillness of a room where something patient is waiting. Otto looked at his watch. "We have approximately 20 minutes, he said. The delivery is complete. The activation device is set. After that, he shrugged. The heretic fleet has excellent surgeons. I've been told the transition period is not as difficult as people assume. He was quiet for a moment. He moved his weight and looked at the crates and then back at me with the expression of a man deciding how much to give away when there is no longer any reason to withhold. The heretic fleet is not what the Directorate thinks it is, he said. The summaries describe it as a naval force with a raiding emphasis, an opportunistic power, a problem to be managed. He paused. It is a sophisticated military intelligence organization that has been running a strategic deception operation against church signals infrastructure for 11 years. What you have been listening to on your assigned frequency bands, what all of us have been listening to, is what they wanted us to hear. The timing intervals you identified, the contact windows, the cipher structure, all of it is managed. Produced to a schedule, designed to shape our operational picture. He looked at my map on the wall of my room. Not at my map, I realized. He was looking at what he thought of when he thought about the kind of work I had been doing, the pencil colors and the patient accumulation of data that turned out to be curated data. You are a better analyst than I gave you credit for. You are still looking at a picture they painted. I thought about this. I thought about the map above my desk, with its blue and red and green pencil marks, and about 18 months of signal logs carefully assembled, and about the particular quality of the 6-minute gap in the transmission schedule that I had found and reported, and that had been dismissed as irrelevant. I thought about whether the 6-minute gap was real or whether it, too, was managed. The secondary frequency, I said. He looked at me. The signal I traced today, was that managed too? Was it supposed to lead me here? Something shifted in his face. The satisfaction was still there, but it had acquired a qualification, the quality that satisfaction gets when it encounters a question it had not prepared for. No, he said after a moment, and that was an operational error. The secondary frequency is a genuine heretic command channel. It was not supposed to be transmitting during the dock operation. A pause. Someone in the crew was using it for a timing check. A protocol violation. So, I found it by accident. You found it because you were paying attention to things other people had decided were not worth attention. He looked at me steadily. Which is a quality I have, in retrospect, underestimated in you. He said this without warmth and without apology, as a simple factual assessment. It doesn't change the situation. No, I said, it doesn't. He stepped toward me. The firefight began in the roof. I want to tell you what a close-quarters firefight inside a condemned dock sounds like. Because the intelligence summaries that had formed most of my understanding of combat described it in terms of unit positioning and engagement geometry and casualty rates, which are accurate descriptions of things that do not capture the experience of being in the space where those things are happening. It sounds like being inside a bell while someone rings it. The corrugated iron roof concentrated the acoustic, and the enclosed water at the far end reflected it, and the stone walls of the dock's rear absorbed none of it, so that each shot produced not a single sound, but a pattern of sounds, the initial report and then its reflections arriving at slightly different times from slightly different angles, creating an effect that was not quite an echo, but was more like the shot being repeated by different voices. This was disorienting in a way that the tactical diagrams in the intelligence summaries had not prepared me for. In a tactical diagram, you know where the shooting is coming from. in the dock, with the lanterns throwing hard shadows in competing directions, and the reflections arriving from every surface. Knowing where the shooting was coming from required exactly the kind of focused attention that the noise and the adrenaline and the ropes on the wrong side of the pillar made very difficult to sustain. The first sound was the corrugated iron overhead, a section of it giving way in a way that was not structural failure, but deliberate forced entry, a rectangle of it dropping inward and landing 3 meters from where I sat, with a sound like a gong being struck. Through the opening came 2 figures in the gray and blue kit of the new Antioch combat engineers, descending on ropes with the controlled efficiency of people who have practiced this entry procedure until it is automatic, rifles up and sweeping sectors before their feet hit the dock floor. More sections of the roof came down, more engineers, 6, 8, 10 of them, filling the dock with the organized noise of professional close-quarters combat. Short commands, sector coverage, the particular disciplined violence of people who are doing a job rather than expressing an emotion. The naval raiders were not surprised for long. They had the same professional quality, and the dock became in seconds a firefight in an enclosed space, which is the kind of engagement where the technical distinctions between the parties become secondary to whoever has the fastest reaction time and the clearest field of fire. I pressed myself against the support pillar to make as small a profile as possible and looked for Otto. He was already moving. He had not drawn a weapon. Otto Reichert, I understood now, was not a person who stood in firefights. He moved along the dock wall toward the rear, toward the strike craft, using the crates as cover, with the practiced, unhurried movement of a man enacting a plan he had considered in advance. The rope hit the pillar beside me. I looked up and she came down it with a speed that suggested she had done this before, Elisabeth von Knobelsdorff in combat engineer kit that was several sizes too large for her, and a sidearm in a chest holster, dropping the last 2 meters in a controlled fall and landing in a crouch beside me with the economical posture I had catalogued from months of corridor observation, applied now to a different purpose entirely. She came down the rope fast and clean and landed in a crouch with the economy of movement she had in every context I had ever seen her, but different now. The economy was directed rather than contained, the stillness of a professional in an active engagement rather than the stillness of a person reading a report at a reading table. She had a sidearm in a chest holster and a combat knife in her right hand, and she moved with her back to the pillar, checking her sectors before she looked at me, which was the correct order of priorities and which I noted with the part of my mind that continued to function regardless. She looked at me. She looked at the ropes on my wrists. She produced a combat knife from her boot and cut them in 4 strokes, 2 each, back of each hand, clean and fast. "You stole a portable direction-finding unit," she said. "Yes," I said. My hands were free. I was having some difficulty processing the simultaneity of events. "And a sidearm. Yes." I tracked the equipment log and the departure register and ran the bearing data on your morning summary. She straightened and looked across the dock, reading the firefight with the same focused attention she had given my log sheet in the cipher library. I called the engineers when I understood what the triangulation was pointing at. A brief pause. "You were right about the 6-minute gap. It's in my report." I stared at her. "We need to move," she said. "Can you walk?" "Yes," I said, which was approximately true. She handed me a secondary sidearm from a holster at her ankle, checked the dock for the nearest clear path to the exit, and moved. I followed because following someone who has just cut your hands free and handed you a weapon in the middle of a firefight is the most straightforward decision I have made in my professional career. We moved along the wall of the dock, using the crates as cover toward the gate. The firefight was concentrated at the boat end. The engineers had established a line across the dock's midpoint, and the naval raiders were fighting from behind the strike craft's superstructure, which gave them cover, but confined them. The engineers had the numbers and the high ground from the roof entry points, and the particular advantage that comes from being people who are doing their job rather than people who have been surprised while doing theirs. A naval raider broke from the boat end and moved along the dock wall toward us guys. Moving fast, crouched, using the crates the same way we were using them. Elisabeth saw him before I did. She moved with the fluid speed I had glimpsed in the corridor and never fully catalogued at. 3 steps to the right around the end of a crate row, and I heard 2 shots very close together, and then silence from that direction, and she was back beside me without having done anything that looked like hurry. She looked at the path to the gate. She looked at me. "Can you run?" she said. "Yes," I said, which was more true than it had been 20 minutes earlier. We came out of the dock into the back street at a run, and the battle behind us continued. The controlled, professional, increasingly one-wide engagement of 10 combat engineers against 8 naval raiders in an enclosed space, which has a predictable outcome when the enclosed space also contains several tons of high explosive, and both parties are aware of this fact. The engineers, I later learned, were very thorough about the activation device. Outside, in the cold harbor air, we stopped. The dock behind us was still. The sounds of the firefight had ended with the abrupt completeness that professional engagements end, not gradually, but all at once, the noise stopping like a switch thrown. I looked at Elisabeth. She was looking at the dock entrance, cataloging the situation in the way she did. "Otto," I said. She was quiet for a moment. "We know," she said. "He got to the boat. The harbor is sealed. He won't get far." She said this with a confidence that I could not fully share because I had seen Otto Reichert move through a firefight with the calm of a man whose exit was already planned, and a man with 2 years of patient preparation behind him does not make plans that depend on sealed harbors. But I did not say this. I was looking at the dock gate and thinking about the thing that was not Otto. The thing that had been in the alley and had followed me here and had been somewhere in the dock in the quality of the air during the firefight, and of which there was now no sign. There was no sign of the Death Commando. Not in the dock. Not in the back streets. Not in the careful post-action sweep that the combat engineers conducted over the following 2 hours, checking every corner of the condemned structure and the surrounding streets, with the thoroughness of people who understood what they were looking for. He was simply gone. The way he had been simply there in the alley. Without transition, without evidence. Without the reassurance of a clear before and after. The debrief took the rest of the day and most of the evening. Fischer conducted it personally, in the office with the actual door, with the senior signals review board present, and I answered every question completely and in order, including the questions about the equipment and the sidearm, about which I was entirely honest. The disciplinary consequence of this honesty was a formal reprimand entered into my service record, which was, given the alternative outcomes available to the day, the best possible result of the worst decision I had made since arriving in New Antioch. The debrief lasted 6 hours. I gave them everything. The secondary frequency, the bearing triangulation, the equipment I had taken, the sidearm, the dock, the crates, the strike craft, Otto's account of his 2 years of preparation, the Death Commando in the alley, the weapon unloaded by someone who had reached it before me. I gave it in the order it had happened, as precisely as I could reconstruct it. and Fischer sat across from me with 2 members of the senior review board and a recording clerk, and listened without interrupting, which was the most sustained attention I had ever received from anyone in the directorate. At the end, Fischer was quiet for a long moment. "The 6-minute gap," he said, "in the transmission schedule." "Yes. You reported it 3 weeks ago." "In my weekly summary." "Yes." Another silence. The recording clerk wrote something. One of the review board members looked at the table with an expression I could not read precisely, though I could read its general category. "The activation devices for the secondary charges have been found and neutralized," Fischer said. "The primary cache at the dock is secure. The strike craft has been impounded. 3 naval raiders are in custody. The others are dead." He paused. The operation that was planned, the scale of it, what it would have done to this building, to the signals relay stations, to the harbor command. "We are looking at a very thorough intelligence about our infrastructure." 2 years of preparation, I said. "Yes." His expression was the expression of a man arriving at an assessment he had been avoiding. "The penetration was very deep. We will need to review everything. Every contact, every signal log, every piece of intelligence produced in the last 2 years will need to be revalidated against the possibility that it was curated." He looked at me. "You understood this from what Reichert told you?" "Yes." "That is a significant piece of intelligence." He paused again. The pauses of Fischer were weighted things, each one doing more work than the words around them. "Your methods were irregular." "Yes." "The equipment, the sidearm, the departure without authorization." "Yes." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he put his pen down and looked at the recording clock. "Note: the actions taken by Brother Metz on the 14th, while procedurally irregular, were operationally critical and demonstrated analytical judgment of a quality significantly exceeding his assigned grade. Formal reprimand to be entered as required by protocol. To be accompanied by a recommendation for Grade 2 review." He looked back at me. "You are dismissed, Brother Metz. Get some sleep." I was promoted to Grade 2 on the final day of the month. The promotion carried with it a new room. Still in the basement. Still without natural light, but 14 feet by 10, with a better chair and a prayer board positioned so that the icon of St. Dismas caught the lamplight at the correct angle for the morning office. Otto was not found. The harbor seal produced a fast strike craft intercepted 3 miles offshore, but the boat had been abandoned with its navigation charts and communication logs destroyed. The activation codes for whatever secondary devices remained cleared from every system. There was evidence of his passage, but not of his person. I think about him sometimes, in the way you think about things that have not been resolved, which is to say, regularly, and without the comfort of conclusion. Elisabeth, I learned later, had tracked the equipment log within 40 minutes of my departure. She had noticed the sign-out discrepancy, run the bearing data from my morning summary against the known port district geography, made 2 telephone calls, one to the harbor authority, one to the combat engineer's duty officer, and had the entry team briefed and at the dock gate in under an hour. She had done this without authorization, without countersignature, without the approval of a Grade 1 officer, because she was, it turned out, exactly the analyst I had assessed her as being in the corridor. Someone who looked at a thing properly and then acted on what she saw. The formal reprimand in her service record was identical to mine. We did not discuss this directly. We discussed in the break room on the morning of my first shift as Grade 2. The signal characteristics of the secondary frequency and the question of whether the heretic fleet's primary cipher structure needed to be reanalyzed from the beginning, given what Reichert had told me about strategic deception. This was a substantive professional conversation that took 40 minutes and produced 3 specific analytical tasks that we divided between us, with the efficiency of people who have established, through shared crisis, a working relationship that doesn't require a great deal of preamble. She refilled my coffee from the urn without being asked, because she had noticed my cup was empty. This was a small thing. I have not forgotten it. I think more often about what I did not see in the post-action sweep, about the quality of patience I had felt in the alley and then felt again as a distinct and particular absence when the firefight ended. About the intelligence summaries that described the Death Commandos as silent specters of carnage. About the 3 who had simultaneously killed the Supreme Pontiff, the High Prophetess, and the Holy Roman Emperor in a single night, about the assessment process that a Death Commando performs on a target, and about what it means when that process does not result in the use of the clause. It means the assessment is not finished. It means the assignment is ongoing. The intelligence summaries I had read described the 3 most infamous Death Commandos by name: Cain, Barabbas, and Haman, who had simultaneously killed the Supreme Pontiff, the High Prophetess Elia, and the Holy Roman Emperor in a single night in 1894, throwing the Church into turmoil and enabling the heretic legion's great offensive across the Levant and Europe. The summaries described this as the defining demonstration of the Death Commando program's capabilities. 3 targets, 3 simultaneous assassinations, 3 of the most protected individuals in the faithful territories, and not one of them survived the night. I did not know if the one who had been in the alley was one of those 3. I did not know if it mattered. What I knew was that the assignment he had been given, the assignment Otto Reichert had arranged, as part of a 2-year operation that had, placed heretic ordnance inside the harbor walls of New Antioch, had not been completed. The Death Commando had been in the dock during the firefight. He had chosen not to use the clause. He had chosen, and the word choice is deliberate because the intelligence summaries made clear that Death Commandos exercise tactical autonomy of a high order to leave, not to withdraw, not to retreat. To leave, which is a different thing. A Death Commando does not leave because the situation has become unfavorable. They are trained in the infernal domains for years, specifically so that no situation becomes unfavorable enough to justify abandonment. The summaries were clear on this. The only reason a Death Commando leaves an incomplete assignment is if the assignment has been reassigned to a future date. If the completion conditions are not yet met, if there is, in the cold calculus of what they are, a better moment still to come. He will know when that moment is, better than I will. I do the morning office now with the icon of St. Dismas in my line of sight, and I say the prayers I know, and I walk to work through the streets of New Antioch, and I look at the shadows between buildings, with the careful attention of a man who has learned that the absence of what you are looking for is not the same thing as its absence. I walk, I look, I listen. I have not stopped. The story continues. The city endures. Faith holds the line.